Daniel Brooks adjusted the sleeves of his grey hoodie as he stepped into the bustling terminal of JFK International Airport. For most travelers, this was just another busy day in transit, families juggling luggage, business people glued to their phones, and overhead announcements echoing across the concourse. But for Daniel, it marked the beginning of something far more deliberate. As the CEO of Skyway Air, one of the fastest-growing airlines in the country, he had flown through this very terminal countless times. But this morning was different. There was no black car escort, no executive assistant trailing behind him, no crisp suit to distinguish him from the crowd. Instead, he wore worn jeans, sneakers that had seen better days, and a ball cap pulled low over his brow. He wanted anonymity. He wanted truth. The idea had come to him weeks earlier, after a string of passenger complaints began piling up in his inbox. At first, they were isolated, minor frustrations about rudeness or lack of professionalism. But soon, a pattern emerged. Passengers, especially those who didn't look the part of a typical first-class flyer, were being treated with subtle contempt, ignored, or even denied the basic courtesy expected in premium service. Daniel's executive team had tried to reassure him, citing training protocols and polished branding efforts, but he wasn't satisfied with surface-level solutions. He needed to see it himself. He needed to feel what his passengers felt, not as the man behind the curtain, but as one of them. As he made his way through the terminal, Daniel was struck by how invisible he felt. No airline staff approached him. No one offered assistance. He passed gate agents, security personnel, and cabin crew without a second glance. For someone used to being the center of attention in corporate boardrooms, the experience was humbling and oddly exhilarating. The lack of recognition meant he could observe without interference, without pretense. He moved with purpose, weaving through the crowd until he arrived at Gate A17, where Flight 425 to Los Angeles was beginning to board. His heart beat a little faster, not from nerves, but from anticipation. This wasn't just a test of customer service, it was a test of character. Daniel had chosen this particular route for a reason. It was a mid-morning flight with a balanced mix of frequent flyers, vacationers, and professionals. More importantly, it was one of the company's flagship routes, often staffed by experienced crew members and monitored for high customer satisfaction. If issues were occurring here, they were likely happening elsewhere too. He glanced around as the gate area filled up. A group of sharply dressed executives chatted near the charging stations. A young mother wrestled with her stroller while her toddler clutched a juice box. Nearby, a college student tapped anxiously on her laptop. Everyone had somewhere to be, but the energy in the air was surprisingly tense. When the gate agent called for first-class boarding, Daniel took a steady breath and rose to his feet. He clutched his boarding pass, printed just that morning under a different name to avoid any database recognition. With quiet determination, he stepped into the line behind a man in a tailored navy suit and a woman wearing pearl earrings and a designer bag. He noticed how the crew at the gate smiled warmly at the passengers ahead of him, exchanging polite greetings and ushering them forward with practiced ease. Daniel, by contrast, received no greeting. The gate agent's eyes scanned him from head to toe, pausing briefly on his sneakers. No words were exchanged as she held out her hand for his ticket. He offered it with a neutral expression, resisting the urge to reveal who he truly was. As the line inched forward, Daniel couldn't help but observe the subtle ways people were sorted, by their clothes, their demeanor, their confidence. He had built Skyway Air on the idea that everyone deserved to be treated with dignity, whether they were flying economy or business class. But now, standing in line with the very people his airline had promised to respect, he began to wonder if the culture he had envisioned had gotten lost along the way. He wasn't here to catch anyone in the act or to shame an employee. He was here to understand what it felt like to be judged, overlooked, or mistreated, simply for not fitting a mold. As the boarding door drew closer, Daniel straightened his posture slightly and stepped forward. This was more than just a routine flight. It was a journey into the heart of his own company, a company that bore his vision, his leadership, and his name. And yet, in that moment, Daniel Brooks was just another passenger with a ticket and a purpose. What he would soon discover would not only shake the foundations of Skyway Air, but also redefine what it meant to lead with empathy, humility, and resolve. As Daniel approached the final stretch of the first-class boarding line, his heart beat steadily, but his mind was sharp. He had already observed how gate agents subtly shifted their tone depending on who approached, warm with well-dressed passengers, indifferent with those who looked more casual. He stepped up, his boarding pass firm in his hand, ready for a smooth entrance. The flight attendant managing the first-class boarding was a tall, poised woman in her late 30s. Her uniform was pristine, and her posture projected both confidence and control. Her name tag read, Heather. Ah! The moment she saw Daniel, her expression flickered, just briefly, but enough to register disapproval. Her eyes darted to his sneakers, lingered on the hoodie, then met his eyes with the kind of scrutiny one would reserve for a misplaced item. Heather didn't offer a greeting or even a polite smile. Instead, she extended her hand and with an arched brow said flatly, "This line is for first-class passengers only, sir." Daniel remained calm. "I know," he replied, keeping his tone neutral, almost gentle. "Here's my ticket." He handed it over, maintaining steady eye contact. Heather glanced at it, then back at him. Her lips thinned, her brow creased slightly, and the air around them thickened. She scanned the pass slowly, as though expecting it to reveal a mistake. She muttered. Then, after an extra beat, she scanned it again. "These kinds of upgrades usually come from promotional events or donation programs," she said aloud, loud enough for several passengers in line to hear. "Are you sure this is the correct boarding group?" The implication stung more than Daniel had expected. Not because of personal offense, he had steeled himself for something like this, but because it confirmed the very problem he had suspected. Assumptions based on appearance were shaping the passenger experience. He could feel eyes on him now. The man behind him, clad in a suit and tapping on his smartwatch, gave a subtle huff. A woman across the roped stanchions narrowed her eyes, trying to catch a glimpse of his boarding pass. Daniel remained composed. "There's no mistake," he replied evenly. "This is my seat." But Heather didn't back down. "Sir, I'm going to need to verify this with a supervisor. Please step aside," she said with firm finality, gesturing toward the side of the boarding gate. Her tone left no room for discussion, but her words carried the weight of judgment, not protocol. Daniel moved aside without protest, but a wave of murmurs rose behind him. He heard fragments. "He doesn't look like first class. Maybe he got a discount." Probably a mistake. The kind of side comments that could chip away at a person's dignity if they weren't ready for it. A woman 2 places behind him, dressed in a sharp navy blazer and wheeling a sleek carry-on, stepped forward. "He's got a valid boarding pass," she said, her voice cutting through the ambient noise. "You should let him through." Heather turned toward her with a rehearsed, tight smile. "Thank you, Mom. I'll handle this," she said, before refocusing her attention on the boarding process. The woman folded her arms, clearly unimpressed by Heather's response, but said nothing more. Meanwhile, Daniel stood quietly by the gate, holding his ground but absorbing every detail. He could have revealed his identity. One word, his name, would have flipped the entire situation on its head. Heather would have backpedaled, apologies would have flowed, and the mood would have shifted instantly. But that wasn't the point of this trip. Daniel didn't want to be treated well because of his title. He wanted to see how people were treated when no one believed they mattered. And right now, Heather had made it very clear. In her eyes, he was an outsider, possibly an inconvenience, and certainly not someone who belonged in first class. As the last of the other first-class passengers boarded, the supervisor arrived, a man in his 40s with a calm demeanor and friendly eyes. He approached Heather, who handed him Daniel's ticket with a whisper. The supervisor gave it a glance, scanned it, and nodded almost immediately. "This is valid," he said, looking directly at Daniel. "You're good to go, sir. My apologies for the confusion." Heather stiffened slightly, her face unreadable as she stepped aside. "Of course," she said, with an artificial smile. "Enjoy your flight." Daniel nodded to the supervisor and quietly walked past Heather, catching the faintest flicker of discomfort in her eyes. He didn't return the smile. He didn't need to. As he stepped down the jet bridge toward the aircraft, he wasn't just carrying a notebook and a boarding pass. He was carrying confirmation. Confirmation that, within the very culture he had helped build, cracks had formed. Subtle, silent, and insidious. The kind that didn't show up on surveys or spreadsheets, and the kind that, if left unchecked, could rot an entire company from the inside. The supervisor arrived with the kind of steady presence that suggested experience and authority, his walk unhurried but purposeful. He wore the Skyway Air uniform like a veteran, neatly pressed, nameplate gleaming under the terminal lights. His name tag read, Greg Jenkins. Unlike Heather, who had greeted Daniel with skepticism thinly veiled as professionalism, Mr. Jenkins approached the situation with a calm, almost measured curiosity. He offered Daniel a nod of acknowledgement before turning to Heather, who handed over the boarding pass with a quiet murmur, as if trying to avoid further attention. Jenkins glanced down at the ticket, pulled out his scanner, and with 2 quick beeps, the green confirmation light blinked to life. "There's no issue here," he said clearly, handing the pass back to Daniel with a reassuring tone. "This is a valid first-class ticket." There was no hesitation, no backtracking, just a simple acknowledgement of fact. Jenkins turned toward Heather, his gaze firm but devoid of theatrics, and added, "Let's continue boarding." Daniel gave a small nod of gratitude to the supervisor, who stepped back to manage other tasks. Heather, meanwhile, stiffened slightly, but quickly plastered on a diplomatic smile, one that failed to reach her eyes. "Of course," she said, with a hint of mechanical politeness, stepping aside. "Enjoy your flight, sir." Her voice, though civil, retained the same undertone of quiet disapproval, as if the confirmation hadn't erased her doubts, only muted them. Daniel said nothing. There was no satisfaction in proving her wrong, no smug sense of vindication. He didn't want to win a confrontation. He wanted to understand the system that had made the confrontation possible in the first place. As he walked slowly down the jet bridge, each step felt heavier, not because of embarrassment or discomfort, but because of what the moment had revealed. The power of a uniform, the power of assumption, the fragile line between service and judgment. He had expected to go unnoticed. Instead, he had been misjudged and, more tellingly, dismissed. Not for anything he had done, but because of the way he looked. Settling into the plush first-class seat near the window, Daniel let out a slow breath. The cabin was cool and quiet, a stark contrast to the tension outside. Champagne flutes sparkled on the center consoles, folded blankets lay neatly across the footrests, and attendants moved about with practiced efficiency. From a design standpoint, everything was immaculate, exactly how Daniel had envisioned when he personally signed off on Skyway's premium experience. But that morning's interaction had exposed the chasm between design and delivery. No amount of luxury could compensate for a lack of humanity. And in that moment, Daniel realized something profound. Customer service wasn't about products, policies, or perks. It was about perception, and perception, in the wrong hands, could become prejudice. He stared out of the oval window, the runway lights flickering beyond the glass, and replayed the entire exchange in his mind. Heather hadn't seen a CEO or even a paying customer. She had seen someone who didn't belong. And while Mr. Jenkins had done the right thing, he had simply done his job, nothing more. There had been no apology, no reflection, just quiet resolution. And Daniel wondered, if he hadn't been the CEO, if that boarding pass hadn't scanned green, would he have been asked to step aside permanently? Would he have been denied what he had rightfully paid for? These weren't theoretical questions. They were real, and they had real consequences. Daniel reached into the pocket of his hoodie and pulled out a small notebook. The same notebook he had used for years during site visits, performance reviews, and company evaluations. He opened to a blank page and jotted down 3 simple lines. Appearance, worth. Service must be unconditional. Culture is revealed in small moments. Then he paused, pen hovering, before writing a fourth line beneath the others. Change starts here. He knew now, more than ever, that the incident at the gate wasn't just about Heather. It was a symptom of something deeper, something woven into the company's culture, perhaps unintentionally, but undeniably real. And as the aircraft began to taxi down the runway, Daniel closed his notebook and folded his hands. The real flight hadn't even begun, but already the journey was underway. As the aircraft gently lifted off the tarmac, Daniel settled into his seat and tried to ease his posture into comfort. The first-class cabin was quiet, filled with hushed voices, the rustle of newspapers, and the subtle clinking of drink glasses. Each seat was designed with luxury in mind, spacious, reclinable, and fitted with personal entertainment screens and privacy partitions. Yet despite the soothing ambiance, Daniel couldn't shake the residual tension from the boarding encounter. He was now seated, his ticket verified, his identity still concealed, but the discomfort lingered. Heather, the flight attendant who had questioned his legitimacy just minutes earlier, moved efficiently through the cabin. But her attitude toward him hadn't changed. In fact, it had solidified into something colder, more deliberate. When Heather reached his row, she didn't offer the standard welcome. There was no greeting, no polite inquiry about his drink preference, or any acknowledgement that he, like the others around him, was a first-class passenger deserving of care. Instead, she placed a neatly folded blanket and a packet containing a hot towel on his side table without making eye contact. Her body turned away from him as quickly as she had arrived, her smile already aimed at the next passenger. Daniel watched closely as she approached the man across the aisle, a tall gentleman in a designer blazer. Her posture straightened, her voice softened. "Good afternoon, sir," she said warmly. "Would you care for a glass of wine before we take off?" The difference was striking. It wasn't just in words, but in tone, in presence, in energy. To Heather, that man belonged. Daniel, it seemed, still didn't. The pattern repeated itself throughout the early minutes of the flight. When a woman 2 rows ahead asked for an extra pillow, Heather responded with cheer and quick service, even engaging in light conversation. When Daniel quietly requested a glass of water, she nodded without speaking, returned with the water a few minutes later, and set it down without a word. It was subtle, perhaps too subtle for an average observer to notice, but Daniel had been watching people for years. As CEO, his job required him to detect the quiet signals, the slight shifts in behavior that revealed deeper truths about culture, leadership, and consistency. And right now, the inconsistencies were glaring. There were no raised voices, no outright rudeness, but what Heather was doing, or failing to do, spoke volumes. Daniel reached into the seatback pocket and retrieved his small notebook once again. He flipped to a clean page and began writing, documenting every interaction. Heather's tone toward 3A, warm. Full name usage, small talk, offered champagne. He flipped back to his own experience. My row, no greeting, no eye contact, no offer of amenities, blanket placed without comment. He wasn't angry, he was focused. Data mattered. If he was to confront this issue systemically, he needed more than anecdotal frustration. He needed evidence. And what he was witnessing wasn't just about one employee's bias. It was about behavior patterns, about how service quality fluctuated based on superficial traits like clothing, grooming, perceived wealth, traits that should never dictate dignity. Further down the cabin, Heather and another attendant named Emily worked side by side. Daniel noticed how Emily, though younger and less senior, carried herself with a natural warmth. She knelt gently when speaking to older passengers, asked questions about comfort, and responded to requests with authentic attentiveness. She didn't seem to judge, to calculate, or to filter her service based on appearance. Her manner felt human. Daniel observed her as she offered a blanket to an elderly man, adjusting it over his knees with a quiet word of kindness. Then she turned to a nervous-looking teenager traveling alone and offered a gentle smile with a glass of ginger ale. The contrast between Heather's and Emily's energy was impossible to ignore. One was performative, hierarchical, the other was grounded and universal. As the plane continued cruising at altitude, Daniel leaned back and looked up at the cabin ceiling, a faint hum filling the space between his thoughts. How many passengers had gone through this, made to feel like second-class citizens in a premium seat, not because of service shortages, but because of subtle signals that said, "You don't belong"? He closed his notebook and placed it on the table in front of him. This wasn't about drinks, towels, or posture. It was about presence. And presence, in hospitality, meant everything. When a passenger is seen, acknowledged, and treated with quiet respect, it leaves an imprint. And when that is denied, even in the smallest way, it leaves a wound. Daniel looked out the window into the sky, his mind already drafting a plan. This flight, he realized, wouldn't just change one employee. It would redefine what it meant to serve with heart at Skyway Air. The cabin had begun to settle into a gentle rhythm. Passengers sipped beverages, adjusted their seats, and tuned into in-flight entertainment. Overhead lights dimmed to a soft glow, and a hushed calm spread across first class. Daniel leaned back slightly, one earbud in place, pretending to listen to music while his attention remained firmly rooted in his surroundings. He had developed this skill over the years, appearing relaxed while remaining alert, picking up on the tones, the body language, and the rhythms of a room. As the cart service moved down the aisle and conversation waned, he noticed Heather and Emily step behind the service curtain into the front galley. Curious, Daniel casually adjusted his posture, letting one earbud slip out just enough to hear their voices more clearly through the thin divider. At first, the conversation was mundane. Comments about the flight duration, a shared sigh over the number of coffee requests. But then Heather's tone shifted, growing sharper, more biting. "Did you see the guy in 2B?" she asked, a sneer evident in her voice. "The one in the hoodie and worn sneakers, sitting up here like he owns the place." Emily's response came with a hint of caution. "You mean the guy with the dark hair? He seemed polite enough. Maybe he just prefers to travel comfortably." Heather scoffed under her breath. "Please. First class. In that outfit. I swear they're giving upgrades to just anyone these days. He didn't even know what to do with the hot towel. It was kind of pathetic." The words hung in the air like a sudden drop in cabin pressure. Sharp, unnecessary, and completely unprofessional. Daniel's jaw tightened, but he remained motionless. His expression didn't shift, his breathing stayed steady, and his eyes continued gazing out of the small oval window. But inside, his thoughts were spiraling. He had heard rude remarks before, seen arrogance, experienced entitlement. But this was different. This wasn't just a moment of unfiltered frustration. It was a display of casual cruelty, spoken with confidence and assumed complicity. Heather wasn't whispering. She wasn't careful. She believed she was among friends, and in that perceived safety, her true attitude was exposed. And that, Daniel knew, was more revealing than any passenger survey or performance review. This was the culture in action, unedited, unfiltered, and completely detached from the company's values. Emily didn't respond right away. She shifted the conversation slightly, offering a neutral, "Maybe he paid for the seat." But even that was delivered tentatively, like someone trying not to rock the boat. Heather brushed it off with a dry laugh, continuing her commentary with increasing smugness. "I just don't get it. He doesn't look the part. I mean, first class is supposed to be for people who belong here, professionals, executives, not whatever that is." Daniel felt the full weight of her words, not because they were aimed at him personally, but because they so clearly represented a sickness within the system. A rot that had nothing to do with skill or training and everything to do with unchecked bias, internalized elitism, and a total lack of empathy. And he wasn't just hearing it. He was living it. Still, he didn't rise. He didn't call her out or pull back the curtain to reveal who he really was. That would have been too easy, too satisfying. Instead, Daniel made a quiet decision. To listen, to absorb, to document. Because what he had just witnessed wasn't just a lapse in judgment, it was a case study in cultural failure. If Heather was this comfortable speaking like that in the open, how often had it happened before? How many other crew members thought the same but kept their voices down? And how many passengers had left flights feeling lesser without understanding why? Daniel pulled out his notebook again and wrote in clean, steady script. Galley talk. Heather, mocked attire, assumed upgrade. Disdain confirmed. Emily, uncertain but passive. Culture tolerance. Red flag. He closed the notebook slowly and placed it back in the seat pocket, then folded his hands in his lap. The hum of the aircraft filled the space around him, a neutral sound to cover the sting of judgment. He stared ahead, not with anger, but with something deeper. Resolve. He had found what he came for. And now he understood. Heather wasn't the problem, not entirely. She was the symptom. The real problem was systemic, a creeping belief that customer worth could be measured by brands, fashion, or familiarity with luxury. That behavior, left unchallenged, had become culture. And culture, Daniel knew, was leadership's responsibility. His responsibility. He took a long breath and leaned back. It wasn't time to act. Not yet. But it was time to prepare. Because when this flight landed, Skyway Air would never be the same again. After the conversation in the galley faded into silence and the curtain was drawn shut once more, Daniel remained in quiet contemplation. The cabin hummed softly with the white noise of engines and murmured conversation, but inside his mind a storm was quietly forming. He had witnessed enough to confirm his suspicions about assumptions, about status, about how subtle shifts in tone and manner could fracture the very experience his airline promised to deliver. But not everything he saw disheartened him. Amid the disappointment, a counterpoint began to emerge. Emily, the younger flight attendant who had earlier responded cautiously to Heather's comments, returned to the cabin with a tray of warm drinks. Her pace was steady, her posture relaxed, and most notably, her eyes were kind. Daniel watched as Emily approached a woman in her 60s who seemed flustered by the control panel on her armrest. Without waiting for a call button, Emily leaned in, smiled, and gently explained how to adjust the seat recline. She then offered the woman a blanket without being asked, and asked if she needed help placing her handbag in the overhead compartment. There was no trace of performance in her voice, only genuine attention. A few rows ahead, a teenager traveling alone seemed nervous and unsure of when to unbuckle his belt. Emily crouched beside him briefly, speaking in hushed tones that conveyed comfort and familiarity, not authority. Daniel made note of it all, not because it was extraordinary, but because it was so simple and yet so rare. Eventually, Emily reached Daniel's row. She paused for a moment and glanced at him, not just at his seat number, but at him. "Sir," she said quietly, her voice pitched low enough not to draw attention, "I just wanted to make sure everything's okay. If you need anything at all, just let me know." There was no rehearsed smile, no empty courtesy. She looked him in the eye, and in that brief moment, Daniel saw something profound. Respect, offered freely, with no expectation in return. He gave a slight nod. "I'm all set for now," he said. "Thank you." Her expression didn't change, but her presence lingered for a second longer before she moved down the aisle, offering the same tone and attentiveness to the next passenger. The contrast was undeniable. Where Heather had performed hospitality with calculation, selectively and based on perception, Emily extended care universally. She didn't seem to filter passengers by clothing, age, or posture. Her service didn't change depending on whether the person looked like a CEO or a college kid. And Daniel realized this was more than personality. This was about influence. This was about culture. Somewhere along the line, Emily had absorbed a different message about what it meant to serve, and whether that came from instinct, upbringing, or a rare encounter with an inspiring mentor, it had survived in her daily routine, even when surrounded by colleagues who hadn't held on to the same clarity. Daniel reopened his notebook and began a new page, titling it Behavioral Contrast. He listed side-by-side observations, Heather's dismissiveness versus Emily's attentiveness, Heather's selective warmth versus Emily's consistency. Then he drew a box around a single phrase. Training alone is not enough. Culture is what reinforces behavior when no one is watching. That insight echoed louder than anything said aloud on the flight. Emily, without knowing it, had become the unexpected hero of this journey, a quiet example of what was still possible when the right values took root and were protected over time. And Daniel felt something stir in his chest, not just hope, but responsibility. Because while Emily had chosen kindness, the environment had to be built to reward it, not punish it. As the flight entered its final cruising stretch and the lights dimmed further for rest, Daniel gazed around the cabin and thought not about the luxury or legroom, but about the people entrusted to deliver those things with meaning. What kind of environment had he allowed to grow? One where someone like Heather could mock a passenger without fear of consequence, while someone like Emily operated under the radar, quietly doing what was right. Leadership, he reminded himself, wasn't about slogans or mission statements. It was about how the smallest acts reflected the largest truths. And now, with clearer eyes than ever, he knew that what needed changing wasn't just one person, but the entire system that shaped her choices. As the plane continued its journey westward, cruising high above the clouds, Daniel Brooks sat still in his seat, his gaze fixed on the twilight, stretching endlessly across the horizon. The gentle hum of the engines served as a backdrop to the growing storm inside him, not one born from anger, but from realization. He hadn't set out on this flight to catch anyone doing wrong. His mission wasn't rooted in confrontation or control. It had been born out of curiosity, and now clarity. For the past several hours, he had watched a microcosm of his company play out before his eyes. Two flight attendants, one uniform, yet two completely different expressions of service. One moved with warmth, humility, and a sense of shared humanity. The other with judgment, performance, and a transactional attitude. And it was in this contrast that Daniel saw the state of Skyway Air's culture, not in theory, but in truth. He cast his memory back to the founding days of the airline, back when Skyway Air was nothing more than a startup with a rented plane, a handful of idealistic employees, and a mission that had been printed proudly in every training manual. Every passenger, every time, with dignity, care, and respect. Those weren't just words. They were promises. Daniel remembered sitting in meetings late into the night, debating the details of service protocol. Not because he wanted perfection, but because he believed in purpose. He had told his first hires, "We're not just in the business of flying people from one place to another. We're in the business of making them feel seen along the way." Somewhere between then and now, that philosophy had begun to fade. Not entirely, but enough that its absence could now be felt. In Heather's comments, in the silence of others, in the sting of judgment when he tried to board the plane like any other customer. It wasn't just the words Heather had spoken that disturbed him, it was the ease with which she had said them. There had been no fear of accountability, no pause to consider whether her behavior aligned with the company's values. That's what troubled him most. Not the attitude of one flight attendant, but the environment that allowed such an attitude to go unchecked. Culture, Daniel knew, wasn't about what was written on the walls at headquarters. It was about what people did when no one was watching. And this flight, in all its subtlety, had revealed just how far parts of the organization had drifted from the vision he once held so dearly. The airline still wore its luxury brand with pride, but luxury without soul was hollow. And now Daniel had seen the cracks running beneath the polished veneer. He reached into the seat back again, retrieved his notebook, and flipped to a page near the front, where years ago he had written the company's mission statement by hand, refining each phrase until it captured the heart of Skyway. He read it silently, then underlined one phrase: empathy in motion. He closed his eyes for a moment. Was that still true? Was empathy still moving through the cabin with every cart, every interaction, every smile? Or had it been replaced with efficiency and selective courtesy, distributed only to those who looked the part? He thought of Emily and how she had instinctively embodied that old promise, how her small gestures had upheld the very ideals the company claimed to cherish. And he thought of Heather and how her presence made it painfully clear that somewhere along the way they had begun rewarding the wrong things. This flight wasn't just a test of service, it was a test of soul. And while the cabin appeared calm and comfortable on the surface, Daniel saw the deeper turbulence beneath. He leaned back and exhaled slowly, his mind beginning to assemble a plan, not out of impulse, but out of responsibility. There would be no dramatic press releases, no public spectacles. True change, he believed, started quietly, at the top, with humility. What Skyway Air needed wasn't just a new training video or an updated handbook. It needed a cultural awakening, a return to what made the company matter in the first place. The shift wouldn't be immediate, and it wouldn't be easy, but it was necessary, because a brand built on dignity couldn't survive if that dignity wasn't felt by every single passenger who stepped onto a plane. As the sun began to dip beyond the curve of the earth and the cabin light softened into a golden hue, Daniel looked around once more. The passengers rested in comfort, unaware that the man sitting quietly in 2B was already outlining reforms that would shape their future journeys. He turned to a fresh page in his notebook and wrote 5 words. Reclaim the heart of Skyway. It was more than a phrase. It was a mission reborn, one that would guide every step he took after landing, one that would remind every employee, from gate agents to executives, that dignity wasn't a perk. It was a promise, and he would see to it that it was kept. The next morning, the skyline outside Skyway Air's headquarters shimmered in the early light, casting long golden beams across the polished glass walls of the executive conference room. It was a space designed to inspire vision and clarity, with floor-to-ceiling windows, sleek furnishings, and a circular table where major decisions had been made for over a decade. Daniel Brooks stood at the head of that table, his suit crisp but his expression unreadable. He hadn't slept much. The flight from LA had landed just after midnight, but instead of going home, he'd driven straight to the office and reviewed his notes. Now, with less than 8 hours rest, he had summoned his senior leadership team to an unplanned meeting. The message had been brief. Be in the boardroom by 9 cool. No agenda, just presence. As the department heads filed in, customer experience, crew operations, marketing, HR, and training, the room buzzed with a quiet tension. It wasn't unusual for Daniel to call meetings on short notice, but this time his tone had been different. Not urgent, not reactive, focused. When everyone had taken their seats, he looked around slowly, making eye contact with each person. Good morning, he began, his voice low but steady. I just returned from a flight, one that none of you knew I was on. I traveled under an alias, dressed casually, and sat in first class, not as your CEO, but as a regular customer. The silence deepened. No one moved. No one dared interrupt. Daniel's eyes didn't waver. And what I saw, he continued, left me deeply concerned. He didn't name names. He didn't need to. Instead, he painted the picture with precision. A gate agent who dismissed a passenger based on appearance, a lack of warmth during the boarding process, and subtle disparities in service that revealed unconscious bias at best and institutional disregard at worst. He described overhearing dismissive comments in the galley, witnessing how service changed depending on whether the passenger looked wealthy or ordinary, and the stark contrast between 2 flight attendants, one who served with genuine care and another who served with judgment. What I experienced, he said, pausing, wasn't a one-off. It was a reflection of a culture that has slowly, quietly drifted from the values we say we stand for. Around the table, the mood shifted from surprise to discomfort. The head of crew operations sat forward, brow furrowed. The director of training scribbled something on a notepad. The marketing VP looked downward, suddenly reflective. Finally, Daniel stepped back from the table and walked to the whiteboard at the far end of the room. He picked up a marker and wrote 2 words in bold. Respect matters. He turned to face them again. It's a simple phrase, he said. But lately, we've allowed it to become conditional, dependent on appearance, assumptions, or convenience. And that stops today. We are not fixing a PR issue. We are confronting a cultural reckoning. He then opened the floor, not for excuses, but for action. I don't want your defenses. I want your ideas, he said. How do we make empathy a core competency, not just a slogan? How do we ensure accountability that doesn't rely on customer complaints or viral videos? Slowly, hands began to rise. Lisa, from crew training, proposed a mandatory empathy immersion course, not just a compliance refresher. Ryan, from customer experience, suggested real-time service reviews submitted by passengers directly after flights. A younger member of the talent development team recommended implementing an anonymous peer feedback system for in-flight crew. The ideas came faster now, genuine, thoughtful, and tinged with urgency. Daniel listened to each one, nodding, occasionally interjecting with guidance, but mostly allowing the team to build momentum together. As the conversation evolved, one theme stood out. This wasn't just about behavior, it was about belief. Skyway Air had long advertised luxury, comfort, and world-class service. But somewhere along the line, it had failed to ask who those promises were truly meant for. Daniel made it clear. We are not a luxury brand if our service is only luxurious for those who look the part. We are not world-class if our class is measured by clothes instead of compassion. Heads nodded around the room. What began as a confrontation was transforming into a collective call to action. By the end of the meeting, a preliminary roadmap had emerged. Empathy training, executive fly-alongs, peer and passenger feedback systems, and a new recognition program celebrating compassion over upsells. As the team dispersed, Daniel lingered in the room for a moment, alone. He looked back at the words on the whiteboard and quietly added a third: culture. Because in the end, that's what it all came down to. Not protocols, not policies, but the invisible architecture of belief and behavior that guided every employee, every day. He knew the journey ahead wouldn't be easy. Resistance would come. Change, especially cultural change, never arrived without discomfort. But he also knew this: the flight he had taken had already begun to reshape the future of Skyway Air. And now, with a team willing to rebuild from the inside out, they had the power to make that shift permanent. The soft hum of the air conditioning was the only sound in the small meeting room on the 12th floor of Skyway Air's corporate headquarters. Heather sat alone at the conference table, her back straight, but her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her uniform was immaculate, as always, but the confidence she wore so easily in the cabin seemed to have evaporated somewhere between the security desk downstairs and the email that summoned her here. It had arrived that morning with a simple subject line: internal review meeting, mandatory attendance. No explanation, no details, just a time and a room number. She had entered with a mental checklist of scenarios, perhaps a minor passenger complaint or a procedural clarification. But as the minutes ticked by in silence, something deeper stirred inside her. And then the door opened. Lisa Carmichael, Director of Crew Training, stepped inside. Calm, composed, and always collected, Lisa was known throughout the company as firm but fair. She offered Heather a brief nod before sitting across from her. On the table between them was a slim folder, embossed with the Skyway Air logo. Lisa opened it without a word, flipping through a few pages before settling her gaze on Heather. "Thank you for coming in today," she began, her voice professional but not cold. "We're here to discuss your recent flight from JFK to LAX. Heather gave a slight nod, her throat suddenly dry. "There were several concerns raised about your conduct during that flight, particularly during the boarding process and your interactions in the first-class cabin." Lisa paused. "Do you recall speaking with a passenger who was dressed casually, hoodie, sneakers, boarding first class?" Heather's eyes flickered as the memory rushed back in vivid color. The man with the unkempt sneakers, the boarding pass she double-checked, the uncomfortable hesitation, and yes, the moment she'd asked him to step aside. "I remember," she said slowly. "I thought he wasn't dressed appropriately for first class. I assumed there might have been a mistake." Lisa didn't respond immediately. Instead, she tapped the folder lightly with her fingers. "What you may not know," she said, "is that the passenger in question was Daniel Brooks." The words landed with a heavy thud. Heather blinked, her mouth slightly open. Daniel Brooks, Our CEO? Her voice was barely audible. Lisa nodded. He was traveling undercover to observe how passengers are treated when their status isn't obvious, and he had a front-row seat to your behavior. The silence that followed was excruciating. Heather's face drained of color, her mind spinning back through every moment of that flight, the tone she had used, the dismissiveness, the things she'd said in the galley. "I didn't know," she whispered, eyes wide. "If I had known." Lisa held up a hand gently but firmly. "That's the point, Heather. You shouldn't need to know someone's title to treat them with dignity." Her voice softened just slightly. "Respect is not a reward we hand out based on appearance. It's the foundation of our brand, of our humanity." Heather looked down, the weight of shame pressing into her chest. She had always believed herself to be competent, polished, and by the book, but now all of that felt hollow. "I'm so sorry," she said quietly. "I didn't mean to make him, or anyone, feel lesser." Lisa closed the folder, folding her hands calmly on top. "Daniel isn't interested in punishing you. He believes in second chances, but only if they're earned." "Oh," she slid a document across the table. "You'll be enrolled in our new empathy training program, effective immediately. It's not a checkbox course. It's designed to challenge your assumptions, expand your perspective, and rebuild how you engage with every passenger, every day." Heather nodded slowly, a mixture of embarrassment and relief washing over her. A part of her had expected termination, a final judgment. But instead, she was being offered something far more meaningful, the opportunity to grow. "I'll do it," she said, her voice steadier now. "I want to do better." Lisa stood, offering Heather a final look, one that was not harsh but reflective. "I believe you can," she said. "But remember this. Your uniform grants you authority, yes, but it also places a sacred trust on your shoulders. That trust is earned not by protocol, but by how you treat people, especially those who can't do anything for you." With that, she walked toward the door, pausing briefly before exiting. Heather remained seated for a long while after she left, her eyes unfocused, her heart pounding, not with fear, but with the weight of realization. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't thinking about promotions or performance scores. She was thinking about the man in the hoodie and what it truly meant to serve. The first day of empathy training was unlike anything Heather had anticipated. She had walked in expecting lectures, maybe some videos, perhaps a workbook filled with hypothetical scenarios. Instead, what she found was a circle of her peers, some flight attendants, some crew leads, all seated in a quiet training room bathed in natural light. At the center of the circle sat a facilitator, not from HR, but a psychologist who specialized in workplace culture and emotional intelligence. The message was clear from the start. This wasn't about checking a box. It was about transformation. The first exercise? No manuals, no scripts, just stories. Each participant was asked to recall a moment they had felt invisible, on the job, in public, or even in childhood. Heather listened, at first guarded, then slowly uncoiling as she heard tales of quiet pain, overlooked humanity, and simple, overlooked kindness. When it was her turn to speak, she hesitated. The room was silent, patient. Finally, she said, "I once turned a passenger away. Not with words exactly, but with how I made him feel. I thought I was being firm, efficient, but now I realize I was being unfair because of what he wore, how he looked. I didn't see the person. I only saw what I assumed." Her voice wavered, but no one judged, and something inside her began to shift. Over the following days, the training challenged her more deeply. Role-playing with elderly passengers, handling frightened children, responding to nonverbal cues from people with disabilities. These weren't simulations to her anymore. They were reflections. And with every exercise, every moment of vulnerability, Heather began the slow work of dismantling the quiet judgments she hadn't even realized she carried. Weeks later, she stepped onto a Skyway Air flight bound for Seattle. The uniform felt different now, no longer just a symbol of authority, but of responsibility. From the moment passengers began boarding, she made deliberate choices. She greeted each person with eye contact, not just rehearsed smiles. She knelt to speak to a woman in a wheelchair at eye level. She complimented a nervous teenager's jacket to help ease his anxiety. She adjusted a mother's tray table while her hands were full with a fussy baby. Her actions weren't grand, they were human, and they flowed not from obligation, but from an internal compass that had been recalibrated. She no longer saw passengers as categories or types. She saw people, and each one, she believed now, was worthy of her full presence. Toward the middle of the flight, as she handed a warm cup of tea to a quiet man in seat 2B, she offered a soft, sincere, "Let me know if you need anything else." He looked up, smiled, and thanked her. She moved on, unaware of the weight behind that glance. It was Daniel Brooks, dressed again in casual attire, no suit, no entourage, no hint of CEO status. He had quietly boarded the flight without revealing his identity. This wasn't a test, not anymore. It was something else, a moment of witness. He watched from his seat as Heather moved through the cabin with genuine grace. Her tone never shifted based on attire. Her kindness wasn't reserved for the wealthy or polished, and for Daniel, this wasn't just reassuring. It was redemptive. He saw her check on an elderly gentleman who had fallen asleep, adjusting his blanket without waking him. He noticed how she offered a refill to a man in coach who looked weary, even though it wasn't technically her assigned section. Her laughter with a young girl in row 4 didn't feel forced. It felt like connection. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel didn't feel the urge to jot down notes or analyze behavior. He simply watched, and slowly his shoulders relaxed. He had hoped change was possible. Now he saw it with his own eyes, not just in policy, not just in strategy meetings, but here, in the aisle, where real service lived and breathed. When the flight landed, passengers began gathering their belongings and offering thanks. Heather moved through the cabin with calm professionalism, but her energy was light, unburdened. As Daniel stood in the jet bridge waiting to disembark, he glanced back once more and saw her helping a young man with his backpack, offering a smile that was full of warmth, not performance. She still didn't recognize him, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that she hadn't changed because of who he was. She had changed because of who she now chose to be. And in that moment, Daniel understood something more profound than any memo or training initiative could convey. Redemption is not about erasing mistakes, it's about rising beyond them. And Heather, in 8 months, had passed since Daniel's undercover flight, a journey that had begun with discomfort but ultimately ignited a transformation. At first, change was quiet. A few revised training modules here, an internal memo there. But Daniel knew that cultural reform couldn't be a whisper. It had to be a movement, visible, tangible, and embraced from the ground up. Under his leadership, Skyway Air officially launched a sweeping initiative that would forever alter the DNA of the company. It began with the Empathy in Motion program, a required training experience for all flight crew and gate staff, built not just on protocol, but on emotional intelligence, humility, and human connection. Soon after came peer-to-peer review circles, where staff evaluated one another not just on performance, but on presence, on how well they embodied the values of kindness, patience, and respect. But perhaps the most celebrated addition was the launch of the Sky Heart Stars Initiative, a monthly recognition program honoring those who went above and beyond in showing empathy, especially in the quiet moments that rarely made it into reports. Crew members nominated one another anonymously, and passengers were encouraged to submit stories of meaningful interactions. Each Sky Heart star was featured in the company newsletter, awarded a travel stipend, and, perhaps most importantly, publicly celebrated as a role model of what Skyway now stood for. It wasn't about celebrity or perfection. It was about heart. And for the first time in years, the internal bulletin boards weren't filled with metrics or promotions. They were filled with stories. Stories of someone kneeling to tie a child's shoelace, of someone comforting a grieving widow, of someone, in a moment of stress, choosing kindness over convenience. To Daniel's quiet satisfaction, one name kept appearing again and again: Heather Monroe. The same flight attendant whose casual dismissal had once sparked an internal reckoning was now being recognized as one of the company's most improved and most compassionate crew members. Her transformation had not gone unnoticed, not by her peers, not by passengers, and certainly not by Daniel. She didn't seek attention. She didn't tell her story at staff meetings or post about her growth on social media. She simply did the work. She showed up early. She stayed late. And most of all, she made every passenger feel like they belonged. When she was named Sky Heart Star of the Quarter, the email included a note from a frequent traveler who wrote, "Heather made me feel like a person again after the worst week of my life. I didn't expect that on a flight. I'll never forget it." Daniel read the note twice, then leaned back in his chair and looked out the window of his corner office. The city stretched out before him, hustling, evolving, just like the company he had built. But now it felt different. The same walls that once echoed with business forecasts and branding meetings now pulsed with something deeper. Conversations about service weren't just about what looked good, they were about what felt right. New hire orientations began with empathy exercises. Executive meetings opened with real passenger letters. Even marketing campaigns shifted tone, highlighting authentic moments of care rather than luxury for luxury's sake. The airline wasn't just changing, it was remembering who it was always supposed to be. And Daniel, watching it all unfold, felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. He had spent so long building, scaling, competing. But now he was rebuilding, with intention, with clarity, with compassion. He wasn't just proud of the numbers on a chart. He was proud of the human beings walking the aisles of every aircraft wearing the Skyway Air pin over their hearts. In truth, he didn't need anyone to know about his undercover journey. That moment belonged to him. But the impact of it, the ripple it had created, was now everywhere. In smiles exchanged during turbulence, in flight attendants who knelt to meet eye level, in every thank you that felt real, not required. As another day came to a close and the office began to empty, Daniel remained seated at the boardroom table, the sun casting a warm glow over the Skyway logo etched into the glass wall behind him. He picked up a pen and scribbled 4 simple words in his notebook, words he had come to believe with every fiber of his being. Empathy is good business, and in that quiet moment he smiled. Not the smile of a CEO closing a quarter, but the smile of a man who had seen the heart of his company go astray and had watched it find its way back. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you reflect on what true leadership and empathy look like, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. At Deep Inside HQ, we tell the stories that often go untold, the quiet transformations, the hidden lessons, the moments that remind us all of our shared humanity. Subscribe now to join a community that values purpose over pretense, people over profits, and truth over convenience. New stories drop every week, and your support helps us keep shining a light on the changes that matter most. Let's rebuild culture, one story at a time.